All right, so buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into some pretty intense policy proposals.
Oh,
You
yeah.
guys sent in some excerpts from this thing called Project 2025. And let me tell you, this document,
It's a doozy.
it does not mess around when it comes to reshaping the Department of Homeland Security.
It really doesn't. I mean, right off the bat, they jump right in with a truly radical recommendation.
Right.
Just completely dismantling DHS.
Well, hold on. Dismantling it, like complete.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big move. What's the logic behind such a drastic?
Yeah. It's
Okay,
it's a big one. The document basically argues that, DHS has been around for 20 years and it just hasn't achieved that like unity and effectiveness that they were hoping for.
Mhm.
They point to all these issues, mission creep, overlapping responsibilities between all the agencies, lack of clear accountability.
Yeah.
So they're like, why are we trying to fix this system that's inherently flawed? They think breaking it up would just allow these agencies to focus on their core missions and actually be more efficient.
So instead of
Yeah.
trying to like fix the system that they see as like inherently flawed, they're just like, let's just start from scratch.
Pretty much.
Wow.
Yeah, and their proposed restructuring is pretty significant.
Yeah.
They suggest creating a brand new cabinet-level agency,
Oh, wow.
specifically for border and immigration.
Right.
They're talking about merging CBP, ICE, USCIS, even pulling in parts of Health and Human Services and the Department of Justice.
Wow.
We're talking over 100,000 employees.
Jeez.
This would be the third largest department.
That's a massive consolidation of power.
It is.
What are like the potential implications of creating such a like large and powerful agency?
Well, that's a million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
The document obviously argues this is going to streamline operations, reduce bureaucratic hurdles. But on the flip side, you have this concern that such a behemoth could become even more difficult to manage and hold accountable.
Yeah.
Is that classic trade-off,
Right.
efficiency versus potential risks?
Then there's the idea of moving CISA,
Yeah.
the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency,
Right.
to the Department of Transportation,
Interesting.
which seems like a weird choice.
Yeah.
Considering like,
Yeah.
their expertise in cyber threats and infrastructure.
So it seems like they are thinking of CISA's role as primarily focused on protecting physical infrastructure from cyber attacks.
Okay.
And transportation systems are a key component of that.
Right.
So this shift kind of suggests a more limited scope for CISA,
Okay.
potentially moving away from things like countering misinformation online, which the document argues is outside the government's purview.
So a more focused and maybe more traditional role for CISA
Yeah.
within the context of physical infrastructure.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, now what about FEMA? Where do they fit into this proposed shakeup?
So they propose moving FEMA
Uh-huh.
to either the Department of Interior or Transportation, depending on what happens with CISA. And they even suggest that the Coast Guard could be placed under the Department of Justice
Wow.
or potentially the Department of Defense during wartime.
That's a lot of moving pieces.
It is.
Is there like a common thread that runs through all these like agency shifts?
I think it boils down to streamlining and consolidation with a focus on aligning agencies with what they see as their most logical departmental homes.
Yeah.
There's also this sense of prioritizing traditional security and enforcement functions,
Okay.
And
then there's TSA,
Oh, yeah.
which everyone, deals with.
Right.
The Transportation Security Administration,
Mm-hmm.
which they propose to just straight up privatize.
That would affect a lot of people.
That's something that would directly affect pretty much anyone who travels.
Yeah,
I mean,
big time.
what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the document argues that privatizing TSA could lead to cost savings and potentially even better service.
Okay.
They point to the Canadian model as an example. But of course, there are valid concerns about maintaining security standards and ensuring proper oversight
Yeah, for sure.
of these private contractors.
Okay, so that's
a tricky one.
it's a complex issue with potential benefits and drawbacks.
Absolutely.
But here's the thing. The document acknowledges that dismantling DHS might not be politically feasible.
Right.
So they offer an alternative, reforming the department as it exists today.
Right. So this is where we get a glimpse into their vision for what protecting the homeland really means to them.
Okay, let's dive into this reform plan.
Right.
What are some of the key elements they outline?
Well, they really emphasize border security and immigration enforcement as top priorities.
Okay.
They even suggest, a heavier hand when it comes to detention and deportation.
So a much tougher stance on immigration compared to current policies.
Yeah. Definitely a more hardline approach.
Okay, and they're also pushing for that more limited role for CISA, particularly when it comes to countering online misinformation.
Yeah, they really don't think that's the government's job.
Hmm.
They argue that deciding what's true or false online shouldn't be a government function.
That raises some interesting questions about the role of government in the digital age
It does.
and its responsibility in addressing things like disinformation.
Absolutely.
And then the cost-cutting measures they propose,
Yeah.
which include not only privatizing TSA, but also FEMA's flood insurance program
Mm-hmm.
and shifting more disaster-related costs to individual states.
Yeah, they really want to shrink the federal government's role in disaster relief.
So a smaller and potentially less active role for the federal government in disaster response.
That seems to be the underlying philosophy.
Okay, now let's zoom in on their specific recommendations for each agency, starting with Customs and Border Protection, or CBP.
Okay, that's good.
What are some of the key changes they envision for CBP?
Well, they propose this combination of traditional approaches and some more controversial ideas.
Okay.
For instance, they want to bring back horseback border patrol. Yeah, arguing it offers greater flexibility and reach in certain terrains.
Oh.
They also want to eliminate the concept of sensitive zones where enforcement activities are limited.
So a more assertive and less restricted approach to border enforcement.
Yes. And they also call for a single nationwide standard for detention facilities,
Oh.
which would likely give them more flexibility in using temporary structures like tents.
Which, of course, raises concerns about the conditions in those facilities and whether they meet adequate standards
For sure.
for housing detainees.
Yeah, that's a big concern.
Now, what about ICE,
All right.
Immigration and Customs Enforcement?
Yeah.
What are their proposed changes for that agency?
They basically want to refocus ICE on its core missions,
Okay.
immigration and customs enforcement.
Right.
They argue that the agency has been pulled in too many directions and needs to streamline its operations.
What does that mean in practice? Like, what kind of changes are they proposing?
Well, for one, they want to eliminate T and U visas, which are offered to victims of trafficking and certain crimes. Their rationale is that victimization shouldn't be an automatic pathway to immigration benefits.
That's a significant departure from current policy
It is.
and raises questions about how victims of these crimes would be protected and supported.
Yeah, definitely a controversial proposal.
Exactly. And they also propose dramatically expanding detention bed space for immigrants.
Yeah, they're aiming for a capacity of 100,000 beds,
Wow.
which further underscores their emphasis on detention as a key strategy for
Wow.
deterring illegal immigration.
What about lackey's warrants?
Oh, yeah.
The document mentions these, but doesn't really explain what they are.
Right. So Blackie's warrants are a type of civil search warrant.
Okay.
They're often used in worksite enforcement cases when agents suspect illegal immigrants are employed. And the document basically suggests streamlining the process for using these warrants.
Okay, so potentially more aggressive tactics when it comes to worksite
It
enforcement.
seems that way.
Okay, let's move on to USCIS,
Mm-hmm.
the agency that handles citizenship and immigration services.
Right.
What's in store for them?
This is where they really delve into reshaping legal immigration.
Okay.
They want to shift USCIS back to what they call a screening and vetting agency
Okay.
with a focus on fraud detection and stricter eligibility requirements.
So a more restrictive approach to legal immigration, potentially making it more challenging for individuals to navigate the system.
Yeah, they want to make it tougher to get visas and green cards.
Wow. And they even propose bringing back a denaturalization unit
Oh, yeah.
to investigate and potentially strip citizenship from those who obtained it fraudulently.
That's a pretty controversial idea.
That's a very controversial idea.
Yeah, there are concerns about due process,
Yeah.
making sure that individuals have fair opportunities to defend themselves against accusations of fraud.
Right.
It also raises the possibility of targeting specific groups or individuals based on political motivations.
And on top of that, they want to limit work authorizations
Yeah, especially for those who are in the country illegally.
and push for a merit-based immigration system that favors high-skilled workers
Right.
over those with family ties.
That's a big shift.
So major changes proposed for how we approach both legal and illegal immigration.
Yeah, it's a whole different approach.
We've covered a lot of ground here, but it sounds like this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot more to unpack in this document,
Right.
including their plans for FEMA and the other agencies,
Right.
as well as their legislative and policy wish list.
We'll delve into those in our next segment.
Looking forward to it.
For now, we've given you a good overview of their vision for reshaping DHS,
A pretty radical vision.
from completely dismantling it to a more focused reform plan.
Yeah, they're not messing around.
It's clear they envision a significant shift in how we approach Homeland Security.
Absolutely. It's a whole new ballgame.
All right, so let's pick up where we left off and keep going through this Project 2025 document.
Sounds good.
We saw their, pretty bold proposals for restructuring or reforming DHS, and now it's time to really dive into their specific plans for each agency.
Right.
Last time we focused on CBP, ICE, and USCIS.
You're right.
Now let's turn our attention to FEMA,
Okay.
the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Right.
What do they have in store for FEMA?
Well, when it comes to FEMA, the document really emphasizes scaling back the federal government's role in disaster response.
Okay.
And putting more responsibility on individual states.
So less reliance on federal aid and more emphasis on self-sufficiency at the state level.
Exactly. They argue that FEMA has become too quick to declare federal disasters, essentially bailing out states that haven't adequately prepared for emergencies.
So they're saying that states need to step up and take more ownership of their own risk management.
Right. They want to see states taking more initiative and investing in preparedness and mitigation measures.
Okay, so that raises the question of how they actually propose to incentivize this shift in responsibility. What specific mechanisms do they suggest?
Well, they propose raising the bar for disaster declarations,
Okay.
potentially by adjusting the per capita indicator for damages or even applying a deductible. The idea is to make it more financially challenging for states to qualify for federal assistance.
Right, so they're trying to make it harder to get that federal money.
Exactly. Encourage them to be more proactive.
That sounds like a pretty significant change, and I imagine it's bound to spark some debate
Oh, for sure.
about the role of the federal government in supporting states during emergencies.
Absolutely. It's a tricky balance.
What about situations where states are genuinely overwhelmed?
Right.
Like in the aftermath of a major hurricane or an earthquake, would there still be a role for federal assistance in those cases?
Yes. They do acknowledge that the federal government still has a role to play in catastrophic events.
Okay.
But even then, they advocate for a cost-sharing arrangement where the federal government covers a smaller percentage of the costs,
Okay.
particularly for smaller-scale disasters.
So the goal seems to be to kind of strike a balance
Yeah.
between providing support but also encouraging states to take more financial responsibility.
Exactly. Finding that sweet spot.
Okay, and it's not just disaster declarations they're looking to reform.
Right.
They also take aim at FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program.
Yeah, they have some strong opinions about that.
What's their reasoning there?
Well, they argue that the National Flood Insurance Program has essentially become a taxpayer-funded subsidy
Okay.
that encourages development in flood-prone areas.
So they want to phase it out and just let private insurers take over.
Pretty much, even if it means higher premiums for homeowners.
Yeah, that's a move that could have a major impact on coastal communities,
Oh, absolutely.
many of which rely heavily on that federal insurance.
Right. It would be a big change for them.
It sounds like there's a consistent theme emerging here.
Yeah. What's that?
This desire to shrink the footprint of the federal government and shift more responsibilities to states and individuals.
Absolutely. It's a big part of their philosophy.
And that philosophy extends to their recommendations for the Coast Guard.
Oh, yeah, the Coast Guard.
They want to kind of streamline its mission, focusing primarily on protecting U.S. waters and economic interests,
Right.
while potentially shifting some responsibilities,
Like what?
like the Arctic mission, to other agencies like the Navy.
Okay, so less emphasis on international missions and a more inward-looking approach.
Yeah, that seems to be the gist of it.
Interesting.
They're, emphasizing countering threats like illegal fishing, drug trafficking, and protecting critical infrastructure in U.S. waters.
Okay.
They do recognize the need to modernize the Coast Guard's fleet, but they stress the importance of finding cost-effective ways to do so.
So being fiscally responsible while still maintaining a strong Coast Guard presence.
Exactly. Now let's move on to the Secret Service.
Okay, the Secret Service.
What are their proposals for this agency,
It's a big one.
which has faced, its share of challenges and controversies in recent years?
Yeah, they've had some rough times.
So what do they recommend? Well, they argue that the Secret Service is stretched too thin,
Okay.
trying to handle both protection duties and financial investigations.
Right.
So their solution is to split the agency.
Whoa, hold on. Split the Secret Service.
Yeah, pretty drastic, right?
Yeah, that's a pretty dramatic restructuring.
It is.
What's the rationale behind separating those functions?
Well, the document argues that this split would allow agents to specialize
Okay.
and develop deeper expertise in their respective areas.
So they're saying it would lead to better overall performance.
Exactly. They also suggest closing many Secret Service field offices across the country as a cost-saving measure.
Interesting. And amidst those structural changes, they also wade into a familiar debate.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Transparency around presidential activities.
Ah, yes. That's always a hot topic.
What do they have to say about that?
They propose bringing back visitor logs for all presidential residences, including President Biden's home in Delaware.
Which was a point of contention during previous administrations.
It was.
So they're advocating for greater transparency and accountability,
Yeah.
even if it means pushing back against claims of executive privilege.
Yeah, they want more openness when it comes to tracking who have access to the president.
Okay, so a move towards more openness, at least when it comes to, tracking who has access to the president.
Right, more sunlight on those interactions.
And finally, we circle back to TSA.
Ah, TS.
The Transportation Security Administration.
Yep, back to the airport lines.
They seem pretty determined to pursue privatization for this agency.
Yeah, they double down on their argument that privatization could lead to cost savings
Uh-huh.
and potentially even better service for travelers.
Okay.
They point to the Canadian model, where private companies handle airport security.
But of course, there are always concerns about whether the private sector can maintain the same level of security
Right.
and accountability as a government agency.
Yeah, it's a valid concern.
It seems like they're willing to take that risk, believing that the potential benefits outweigh the risks.
Yeah, they seem pretty confident in that approach.
Okay, so their recommendations for these agencies reveal a clear preference
For what?
for a smaller, more focused government with a strong emphasis on traditional law enforcement and security functions,
Right.
often at the state and local levels.
Yeah, that's definitely a recurring theme.
Okay, so we've covered their agency-by-agency plans,
Uh-huh.
which already paint a pretty clear picture of their vision for Homeland Security.
Yeah, it's starting to come into focus.
But it doesn't end there, right?
Mhm.
They also have a whole section on legislative and policy changes they'd like to see.
Oh, yeah, they have a whole wish list for Congress.
Okay, this is where their vision extends beyond the executive branch
Right.
and into the realm of Congress and federal law.
Exactly. They want to reshape the legal landscape.
They lay out a whole list of legislative proposals,
It's a long list.
and many of them are aimed at significantly tightening immigration laws.
Yeah, they're taking a hard line on immigration.
Okay, let's dive into some of those proposals, because these could have a significant impact on people's lives if they were to be enacted.
Oh, absolutely. These are big changes.
What are some of the key changes they advocate for?
Well, one of their most striking recommendations is to codify something similar to Title 42 authority, which was used during the pandemic to quickly expel migrants at the border.
Right, for public health reasons.
Exactly.
But as we know, Title 42 is set to expire.
Yeah.
Are they suggesting maintaining those border restrictions even after the public health emergency is over?
Yes. They want to create a new legal authority
Wow.
that would allow for those expedited exportations even when there isn't a declared health crisis.
So basically they're saying Title 42 is a good idea,
Uh-huh.
and they want to make it a permanent fixture.
Pretty much, they argue it's necessary to maintain control of the border and deter illegal crossings.
That's a proposal that's sure to generate a lot of debate,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
especially among those who argue that Title 42 violated asylum seekers' rights.
It's a very controversial topic.
What else is on their legislative agenda?
Well, they want to make significant changes to the laws governing unaccompanied minors
Okay,
who arrive at the border.
so the kids who come here alone.
Right. They argue that the current system incentivizes families to send their children on dangerous journeys, believing they'll be granted entry.
So what kind of changes are we talking about?
They suggest either repealing or significantly amending the William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act.
Jeez, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a long one.
What does that act do?
It offers certain protections to these minors.
Okay.
They also want to give DHS more authority to detain unaccompanied children, potentially shifting responsibility away from the Department of Health and Human Services.
That would be a big change.
It would.
From the current policy, which generally prioritizes placing these children with family members or sponsors
Right.
while their cases are processed.
It's a different approach, for sure.
What about asylum seekers in general?
Okay.
Do they propose any changes to the asylum process?
They do. They want to raise the bar for establishing a credible fear of persecution,
Okay.
which is the first step in the asylum process.
Right.
They also want to revive policies like the Remain in Mexico program,
Oh, wow.
which required asylum seekers to wait in Mexico
Right.
while their cases were adjudicated in the U.S.
Those policies were highly controversial
They were,
during previous administrations, facing legal challenges and accusations of human rights violations.
yeah, a lot of people push back against those policies.
It seems like this document suggests that they'd be willing to revisit those policies,
They would.
arguing that they're necessary to deter frivolous asylum claims and prevent abuse of the system.
Right. They see it as a way to control the flow of migrants.
And they also want to restrict access to employment authorization,
Yes,
Right.
for asylum seekers and other migrants.
making it much harder for them to work legally in the U.S. while their cases are pending.
Yeah. That would make things very difficult for them.
That would have a significant impact on both those individuals
Sure.
and the broader labor market.
Absolutely. It could lead to shortages in industries that rely heavily on immigrant labor.
What about enforcement at the state and local level?
Yeah.
Do they address that?
They want to empower state and local law enforcement to play a bigger role in immigration enforcement, arguing that federal resources are stretched too thin.
So they're basically saying, let's get the locals involved.
Pretty much deputize them to help with immigration enforcement.
That's a controversial approach.
It is.
What specific measures do they propose?
Well, they suggest that Congress should explicitly authorize this kind of collaboration
Okay.
between federal and local law enforcement,
Hmm.
and even create financial disincentives for so-called sanctuary cities
Right.
that refuse to cooperate with ICE.
So punish cities that don't play ball.
Exactly, put some pressure on them.
That could lead to increased tension between local communities and federal immigration authorities,
Yeah, it could create some real friction.
potentially creating a climate of fear and distrust among immigrant populations.
It's a delicate situation for sure.
It's a complex issue with potential downsides,
Definitely.
but it aligns with their overall emphasis on stricter enforcement and greater involvement of local authorities
Right. They want all hands on deck.
in immigration matters.
Exactly, a united front.
Now, beyond legislation, they also delve into executive actions that a president could enact
Right.
without needing congressional approval.
That's a powerful tool.
What are some of the highlights there?
Well, they suggest immediately reinstating policies like the Remain in Mexico program
Okay.
and ending the practice of issuing notices to report.
Right, those notices that allow migrants released from custody to check in with ICE at a later date.
Exactly, they want to get rid of those.
So they want to make it much harder for migrants to enter and remain in the U.S., even if they have pending asylum claims.
They argue that these measures are necessary to deter illegal immigration
Right.
and maintain control of the border.
Okay. And they also want to restrict the use of parole,
Uh-huh.
a legal mechanism that has been used to grant temporary entry
Right.
to certain groups of migrants,
They want to limit that.
arguing that it should be reserved for truly exceptional cases.
Yeah, they want to tighten up the criteria for parole.
It's clear that their legislative and executive wish list is focused on significantly tightening immigration laws and policies.
Absolutely no doubt about it.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from agency-specific changes to sweeping legislative proposals.
It's a comprehensive plan.
It's clear that this document envisions a significant overhaul of how the U.S. approaches Homeland Security and immigration.
Yeah, they're proposing a major shift in direction.
Absolutely. It's a whole new approach. And it's important to understand these proposals in the context of, the ongoing political debates.
Right, this is a blueprint for a particular vision of Homeland Security.
Whether you agree with them or not,
Oh.
these ideas are shaping policy discussions
Yeah, they're out there in the world.
and could have a real impact on how these issues are addressed in the future. Okay, so we've gone deep on their plans to restructure or reform DHS, and we've explored all the specific proposals, for each agency and that whole legislative wish list.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It's clear they want to, completely change how the U.S. does Homeland Security and immigration policy.
Uh-huh.
But there's one more layer we got to unpack.
Okay.
They have a lot to say about how DHS operates internally, like,
Yeah.
the nuts and bolts of the department.
Right, the inner workings.
Yeah,
It's interesting because they're not just focused on, like, what DHS does.
right.
They're also really concerned with how it does it.
Okay,
They want to, like, reform the department's leadership structure,
okay.
streamline all these processes, even eliminate certain offices that they think are just unnecessary.
So it's all about efficiency and making sure everyone's on board with their agenda.
Yeah, basically they want to make sure everyone's rowing in the same direction.
Okay, so where do they start?
Well, they start with the secretary's office.
Okay.
They argue that the secretary needs a stronger team of political appointees,
Okay.
people who are aligned with the administration's priorities.
So loyalists, basically.
Pretty much,
Okay.
yeah. And they also want to expedite the confirmation process for leadership roles, potentially allowing nominees to serve in acting capacities while they're waiting for Senate approval.
So they want to move quickly and decisively,
Yeah,
maybe to like avoid any potential roadblocks or pushback from Congress.
right. Minimize any delays or resistance.
Okay, what about the internal structure of the department? What kind of changes are they proposing there?
They advocate for a soft closure of certain offices.
What does that mean?
It means they basically want to phase them out,
Okay.
shift personnel and resources to areas they deem more critical.
So they're going to cut the fat, so to speak.
Pretty much, yeah, streamline the bureaucracy.
Okay. And they also want to crack down on what they see as wasteful spending,
Right.
particularly in FEMA's grant programs.
Yeah, they argue that these grants have become a form of political patronage with very little accountability.
So a more streamlined and cost-conscious approach to internal operations
Yes.
with a laser focus on aligning resources with their key priorities.
That's the idea.
And it seems to echo their broader philosophy of limited government and fiscal conservatism.
Absolutely, it's all connected.
Okay, and their scrutiny extends to CISA,
Uh-huh.
the cybersecurity agency.
Right.
Remember how they proposed moving it to the Department of Transportation?
I do.
Well, they also want to narrow its focus significantly.
Yeah, they think CISA has gotten too big for its britches.
So what specific aspects of CISA's work do they take issue with?
They're particularly critical of CISA's involvement in countering misinformation and disinformation.
Right, we talked about that earlier.
Yeah, they argue it's not the government's role to be the truth police online.
So they're basically saying, let the free market of ideas sort it out.
Pretty much, yeah. They're very wary of government censorship.
It's a debate that goes way beyond CISA.
It does.
It touches on those bigger questions about, the balance between free speech
Right.
and the potential harms of misinformation,
Yeah, it's a tough one.
especially in a world where information spreads so quickly online.
It's like wildfire out there.
Exactly. And they also want to limit CISA's role in election security,
Yeah.
arguing that it should focus primarily on protecting voting systems from cyber attacks,
Right. They want them to stick to the technical stuff.
rather than engaging in those broader efforts to combat election interference.
Right. So no more getting involved in the political side of things.
So a more technical and less expansive role for CISA, focusing on those cybersecurity threats to critical infrastructure,
That's their vision.
rather than addressing those broader societal issues.
Right. Cyber defense, not social engineering.
Okay, and that same philosophy of streamlining and focusing on core missions applies to their recommendations for other agencies,
Right.
like the Coast Guard and the Secret Service.
Exactly. Stay in your lane.
They also get into some pretty specific details
Oh, yeah. They get into the weeds.
about how different offices within DHS interact and communicate with Congress.
It's all about control and efficiency.
So give me an example.
Well, for example,
Right.
they want to consolidate the department's external communications functions,
Okay.
merging the Office of Partnership and Engagement into the Office of Public Affairs.
So basically they want to streamline the messaging
Yeah, one voice, one message.
and make sure everyone's singing from the same hymnal.
Exactly. Control the narrative.
Okay, what about their interactions with Congress?
Well, they want to limit the number of congressional committees that have oversight over DHS. They argue that the current system is too fragmented and burdensome.
So less oversight from Congress,
Yeah, they want to reduce the number of cooks in the kitchen, so to speak.
which could be seen as an attempt to, reduce scrutiny and potential pushback from Congress, especially from committees that might be critical of their policies.
Exactly. They want to avoid any unnecessary obstacles.
It sounds like they're aiming for greater control and efficiency in their dealings with Congress.
Absolutely. They want calling the shots.
And they also advocate for eliminating entire offices,
Yeah, like what?
like the Office of Intelligence and Analysis,
Oh, wow.
which they argue is duplicative and has been weaponized for domestic political purposes.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is what's behind that.
It reflected deep distrust of certain elements within the intelligence community,
Okay.
particularly those that have been involved in controversial activities,
Like what?
like domestic surveillance or investigations into political figures.
So they want to clean house, so to speak.
Pretty much, yeah. They want to get rid of anyone they see as a potential threat to their agenda.
So it's not just about reshaping the functions of DHS.
Right.
It's also about, like, changing its internal culture
Mm-hmm.
and its relationships with other branches of government.
Yeah, they want to create a whole new environment within DHS.
They envision a leaner, more agile DHS,
Right.
laser focused on their priorities and less concerned with those broader issues like, civil liberties
Yeah.
or community engagement.
It's a very different approach.
It's a vision that prioritizes efficiency, enforcement, and control.
Exactly. Security above all else.
We've covered a lot of ground today,
We have
exploring this document's proposals from top to bottom.
inside and out.
What stands out to you as the most significant takeaway for someone trying to understand their vision?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that this document lays out a very specific roadmap for how a future administration could completely overhaul U.S. Homeland Security. It reveals a philosophy that favors a much smaller and more streamlined government
Right.
with a very strong focus on traditional law enforcement and security functions.
Okay.
They prioritize things like border control, immigration enforcement, and a more assertive, less bureaucratic approach to government overall.
And it's clear that, their vision would represent a major departure from current policies and approaches.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about that.
This deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It has.
It's a reminder that Homeland Security isn't just about protecting us from physical threats.
Right.
It's also about defining what kind of country we want to be
That's a big word.
and how we balance security with our values and our freedoms.
Yeah, finding that balance is crucial.
And as we've seen, those values and freedoms can be interpreted in very different ways,
They can.
leading to very different visions for the future of Homeland Security.
It's all about perspective.
So as you continue to explore these issues, we encourage you to think critically about the information you encounter,
Right.
consider multiple perspectives, and ultimately form your own informed opinions.
Yeah, don't just take our word for it.
Because in a world of evolving threats and complex challenges, the future of Homeland Security is something we all have a stake in shaping.
Absolutely. It's a conversation we all need to be a part of.